The U.S. embargo on Cuba. It's over 60 years old and it has not worked. Back in 1960, the United States placed a trade embargo against its island neighbor, Cuba, in the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution, where a communist government came to power, where the U.S. backed dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, was ousted in a revolution led by Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries won the revolution and took over the island, and the United States didn't like that and put an embargo on Cuba with the expectation that it would cause the Cuban communist government to fall and collapse in a short amount of time. But here we are, over 60 years later, and that has not been accomplished. What I want to talk about in this video is the obvious failures of the Cuban embargo and a lot of the inconsistencies about it too that need to be discussed.
So the point of my video, it is not to defend the communist government of Cuba. It's not to defend Fidel Castro. This video is just taking an honest, practical look at the Cuban embargo and on how decades later it obviously hasn't accomplished its intended goal of causing the communist government of Cuba to fall. The Cuban communist government is not something I'm going to defend because it is a one-party dictatorship, and in Cuba there is no freedom of press. There's a lack of religious freedom. If you go out and protest against the government, you'll get arrested. It is a horrible government that obviously doesn't really work, so I'm not going to defend them. But I'm also not going to defend U.S. policy against Cuba, and I'm not going to defend the Cuban embargo. We're going to take an honest, practical look at how it's just obviously not worked. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the whole point and purpose of the U.S.'s embargo against Cuba has been part of regime change efforts and basically the U.S. punishing Cuba for going communist. Ever since the U.S.-backed dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, was overthrown, the United States has been punishing Cuba for it. The U.S. has been punishing Cuba since 1960, and the U.S. has tried many efforts to try to have the communist government, and in particular at the time Fidel Castro, overthrown. The United States did many assassination attempts against Fidel Castro. The United States did the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which failed to topple the communist government of Cuba. And the United States has been trying to economically cripple and strangle Cuba. And the United States was trying to isolate Cuba. And yet, despite decades of these policies, they have not worked. And let's talk about why they have not worked. So during the Cold War, mostly from the 1960s to the 1980s, Cuba was able to get economic aid from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union helped keep the communist government of Fidel Castro financed. So that worked up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And in 91, the communist government of Cuba started going through some bad economic problems, especially by the mid-1990s. And there were many Cubans leaving Cuba in the mid-1990s during this difficult time, and there was rare protests in Cuba. Yet, despite that, the communist government of Cuba did not fall, as some experts thought it would by that point. Yet, Cuba survived this collapse of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1990s. And it was around the 1990s when many of the countries of Latin America decided they weren't going to keep trying to isolate Cuba anymore. At the beginning of the 1960s, the U.S. was able to pressure most countries in the hemisphere, with the exception of Mexico and Canada, to sever relations with Cuba. And Cuba was mostly isolated in the Western Hemisphere. But by the late 1990s, most of the countries throughout Latin America and Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean, decided it was time to start restoring diplomatic relations with Cuba. So at the very beginning of the 2000s, one country in particular in South America really came to Cuba's rescue, and that was Venezuela. When Hugo Chavez became president of Venezuela in 1999, he decided to start selling a lot of their oil to Cuba and helped them from really collapsing. Venezuela really proved to be a lifeline to Cuba in the 2000s decade. In addition to Venezuela, many of the other countries in the region started, as I mentioned, restarting trade and commerce and tourism. It saved them, from a total economic collapse, and they were starting to reintegrate into Latin America and the hemisphere. And really, the only country that remains hostile with Cuba is the United States. Another thing about the Cuban embargo that I learned about is many of the Cuban migrants who fled to the United States. It was revealed, like during the 2000s and 2010s, that there were some Cuban migrants who, upon earning money in the United States, actually later traveled back to Cuba and took their money with them. And this is something that some newspapers in Florida uncovered in investigations, such as the Sun Centennial. And even Senator Marco Rubio in 2016 even admitted this, that there were some Cubans who came to the U.S. and weren't really political refugees at all, but they were just coming in for economic reasons. And then when they were able to get federal benefits or make some money in Florida or other states in the U.S., then they would go back to Cuba and then come back to the U.S., get some more money, and then come back to Cuba and use that money for having a better life in Cuba. And so then U.S. money did end up going back to Cuba, pretty much circumventing the U.S. embargo. And this problem still does continue and shows one of the loopholes in the Cuban embargo and U.S. immigration policies with Cuban immigrants. So one of the contradictions that I really need to discuss with the whole U.S. embargo on Cuba is how the United States and American companies openly trade and do business with both communist Vietnam and communist China. Look at Vietnam. They are a communist country. The Vietnamese government does not have any press freedom. There is no religious freedom in Vietnam. And if you speak out against the government, you get arrested and put on trial. And then look at China, another one-party communist country. There is no freedom of press. There is no freedom of information. If you speak out against the government, you get arrested. There is no freedom of religion in that country. They have a terrible human rights record. Look at the Uyghur Muslims, forced labor, and then going back to the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, where the Chinese government decided to kill hundreds, if not thousands, of protesters who were calling for an end to communism in China. And the U.S. response to the Tiananmen Square massacre under President George H.W. Bush was he decided to renew most favored nation status with Communist China the next year in 1990. So on one hand, President George H.W. Bush continued to push the Cuban embargo and even push a law called the Democracy in Cuba Act in 1992, but kept renewing most favored nation status with Communist China, rewarding them effectively for the Tiananmen Square massacre. Not even Cuba did something like that. That makes no sense. In 2001, George W. Bush decided to give permanent most favored nation status to Communist China, and at the same time continued advocating and celebrating the Cuban embargo. And by the George W. Bush administration during the 2000s, it was so evident the Cuban embargo hadn't worked. The communist government was still in power despite all of this, and the United States was pretty much breaking its own moral codes by doing business with China and Vietnam while demonizing Cuba. If the United States wants to continue justifying its embargo on Cuba, then the United States should just automatically end all business and trade with China and Vietnam. Or if the United States wants to continue doing business and trade with China and Vietnam, then the U.S. should just end its embargo on Cuba and admit it didn't work. But at the way it's going, it doesn't make any sense, and none of it works. As long as the United States continues doing an embargo on Cuba, then it just continues having the island be in a miserable state while having this impasse where the communist government remains in power, continues relying on repression. The Cuban people occasionally will protest, but it's always put down. So there isn't going to be some mass uprising that's going to overthrow the Cuban government. And then in the meantime, a lot of Cubans will keep leaving. And at this point, Cuban migration to the U.S. has become unwanted by the U.S. So this isn't good for anybody. The United States should try to invest money with whatever private entrepreneurs there are out there in Cuba and try to strengthen them in being entrepreneurs and starting their own businesses, because there is a little bit of that, I think. But just trying to punish the whole island, it just doesn't work. This is an impasse. This is a failed policy. And there should be new steps going forward. But in the end, none of this is up to me, but I'm just observing.